Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to leave it a minute or two. Hello again from Andy Sanford. So I'm the Continuous Improvement Director for We Are Lean and Agile, and we do process improvement work, projects and software to help people improve their processes. And I will pass over to Lenny to introduce herself, not that she needs any introduction.
Folks, good afternoon. Third one of these is crazy. Thank you for joining us. As Andy said, my name is Lenny Bedayan. I am the director and owner of BW Training Limited. We are a training and coaching organisation specialising in leadership management, change management, NLP, bit of anything and everything, but soft skills training. So great to be here. Thank you for coming back.
Brilliant. So you'll be a little bit familiar with our format by now, hopefully. So polls, we're going to use those as we keep getting feedback. People like them. So we've got some polls coming up, and I think we've got the first one here just for everyone. So how much change are you experiencing at the moment? Everything has changed for me in my business. I don't know about you, Lenny. What?
Pretty significant, yeah. Much the same as with you, yeah. Pretty sizable shift.
Yeah, I think I struggle to think of anything that really is the same, if I'm honest. So
yeah,
brilliant. Someone's only got slight alterations. Well done. That's good. Lots of humongous and lots of a lot and lots of quite a bit. So we're just going to step on now. You keep answering those as we go through. Next up, obviously, we're looking to interact with the chat, and Lenny's style is very much to pick up on the chat and work from feedback. So please do keep the chat element coming in. So we're just going to kick another poll off and then move into the chat element. So have you had a chance yet to use any of the techniques that we've covered in the first two webinars? So the control dartboard or NLP at all? And if you have, in the chat, it would be great if you could share some examples. So if you can pop those into the chat, and Lenny will read and inwardly digest those. So I'm just looking at the chat. As you say, Lenny, you get sidetracked with the chat, don't you? So,
yeah.
Anything you want to share in the chat, that's great. As before, obviously, we're going through a presentation with you. That's available in the handouts right now. So feel free to download it, and you can print it and scribble on it if you wanted to. We are in a series of 7 webinars here, and we are in managing personal and professional change. And the next up one is actually an open space webinar. So we are looking for some engagement here, and for some feedback from you as to what we can actually do in that open space. We have some plans, but we very much want it to be an interactive session, and we very much want to react to what your needs are. So anything you'd like to see in that open session? Would you like to see us go back over some of the topics, to go deeper on some of the topics, to just talk about, I don't know, anything really about how we're changing, what things are changing? So that would be great if you could do that.
Just while we're picking up on that, or waiting for people just to catch us up a bit, Andy, just to pick up on the chat around the NLP and control dartboard stuff that you've been using. There's some really, really good stuff here. A lot of people using the preference tests, which is a really good way of understanding what somebody needs. Someone is an NLP preference. I'm very visual, so I need that visual kind of interaction, that visual connection, which is why, as I explained to you on the control dartboard session, these sessions are a bit odd for me because you're lacking that visual feedback. So as a manager, these can be really useful. As a kind of colleague, they can be useful, but they're just really good for kind of interpersonal interaction. And a really good tip actually with that is if you've got somebody who uses a particular preference in terms of their language. So if you've got somebody who says, I just can't see what you mean, or just doesn't look right to me, then a really good tip is just to use what they're using, which is visual language, and just reflect it back. So rather than kind of trying to reinvent it and put it into your own language, so what needs to happen for you to be able to see that? How can I help you see that in a different way? What does that look like now? So really good tip is, you know, that whole now you're talking my language. It's great for rapport. It's great for relationship building. People feel listened to around that sort of language. So just as a little tip, really. In terms of what people would like in more kind of stuff, I think definitely NLP is coming up again. So what's working for you in the current situation? Any other techniques? Yeah, that's a nice one. Maybe we can do a bit of an open forum around that. Use it with the team, especially to relocate to working from home. Absolutely. Control dartboard is really useful, I think, in the current climate. And you will see control dartboard in today's session in terms of some of the narrative, because it fits across so many things. So you know, please do keep those coming. If you've got specific topics you want to cover, what we'll do is we'll turn up and we'll open the webcams up and we'll open the chat up and we'll just respond to what you want. But obviously, if we can have a little bit of forward information and forward knowledge, then we'll make sure we kind of make handouts available and stuff like that. So yeah, please do keep sharing those in the chat and keep pinging them off to Andy or myself. We've got 2 weeks, so between now and the next time we'll look to get something that is fit for purpose.
Great stuff. So without further ado, over to Lenny.
Fabulous. Okay, so I've done Andy a bit of a kipper here because as you can see, I've changed the language. Oh, that's an interesting one. Sorry, just noticed that. Imposter syndrome. I definitely want to pick up on that. So if we can make a note of that, Andy, that might be quite useful. I think for those of you in management roles, mentoring roles, that imposter syndrome stuff is huge. But I would say it can be huge on a personal level too. So it doesn't just have to be I feel an imposter as a manager or as a professional, but actually as a new mum, as someone working in a different environment, as a father with undue pressures or different responsibilities. There's loads of stuff around it. So yeah, definitely we'll pick up on that one, Suzanne. Thanks for that one. So as you can see from my opening slide, I've changed the title slightly, purely and simply because I think it's always interesting when we talk about change and managing change. As you know from one of our workshops, or I think we've called the whole series, Shift Happens. Shift is an arguably an easier word than change. I think change tends to lend itself to a certain reaction in people. So I went through a series of introducing my change workshops as adjustment workshops, but I don't know that people fully understood what I was talking about, so I'll change them back again. But it's an interesting one to think about, and we're going to move into language in just a sec. Before we do anything today, much like last time, please do bear with us with the slides. There is one slide in particular that is very complex and has a lot of stuff going on it, and poor old Andy's got to try and keep up with me. And that's never easy at the best of times. So do bear with us if we lose ourselves a little bit. So thinking about the word adjustment, one of the best tips around language is advice on the next slide, which is to watch your language, to be mindful of the language that you're using. Now, by that, I don't mean effing and jeffing. You know, if you're angry about something, crack on. And any of you that know Andy and I, who are both trying very hard to be not potty-mouthed on live Tinterweb, will know that in real life, we are terribly potty-mouthed. I'm not talking about that type of language. I'm talking about the type of language we use to create our reality. So if you remember last time when we looked at NLP, we talked about actually what is the language I'm using? How am I saying what I can and can't do? What am I deleting? What am I telling myself is true? So in terms of watching your language, how you language change can have a big impact on your experience of change. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to just cover with you the one word at the top of this slide, which is something we call presuppositions. Now, apologies, I think the lady's name was Amy, Andy, the lady who's trying to make notes as I'm talking.
Yeah.
Name? Amy. Oh, we don't need any more on this slide for now, mate. I just want to talk through presuppositions. I'm apologising to Amy in advance because I'm going to tell you what the definition of a presupposition is, and it's a little bit wordy. So I'm going to repeat it a couple of times. So if you want to pop the next line up, Andy, that will give us the narrative. So a presupposition, in terms of language, is something that has to be true in order for a statement to make sense. So just give you a second on that, and then I'll explain what I mean by that. So something that has to be true in order, thank you, Amy, in order for a statement to make sense. So let's try this one out a little bit. Those of you that have children, you use presuppositions all the time. You just probably don't call them presuppositions. So let's give you an example of a fantastic linguistic presupposition. If you were to say to your children, do you want to do your homework before we have tea or after we have tea? What has to be truthful in that statement for it to make sense to that child? What does that child have to accept as truthful for it to make sense? So let me repeat the statement. Do you want to have your, do you want to do your homework before we have tea or after we have tea? Now, this is the painful silence where Andy and I have to bite our tongues and wait for you guys to catch us up. So,
well, I can chip in there. It's got to be that the homework is going to get done.
Oh, absolutely. And what else is implied within that? So do you want to do your homework before we have tea or after we have tea? Absolutely. Thank you, Helen, that it will happen. Yeah. What else is implied in that? I like the fact you're all picking up on that you are going to do your homework. Absolutely. There is also what else implied in that?
Tea is somehow linked to the doing of homework.
Choice, fantastic. Well done, Helen. Yeah, choice. We've given a choice. Well, what we've given is a choice of our making. Any of you that have ever done sales training or kind of negotiation stuff, you know, you give your options, don't you? And then you give the sense of, well, that person has a choice. So yeah, those of you that have partners, really good one. Are you putting the bins out now or are you putting them out later? Either implied within that is that, yeah, I like that one. That's a really clever one. Implied in my do you want to have your do your homework before or after we have tea is that children don't drink coffee. I like that. That's lateral thinking, that one. So yeah, there's some interesting ways in which we can use language, and of course one of the biggest exponents of using language in presupposition language in really, really unhelpful ways is the very wonderful Mr. Donald Trump. He was using NLP presupposition language in the most scary, horrific kind of a way. But once again, I think I did this last time. Let's not get into politics because we got enough of that going on. So yeah, it's interesting to watch. If you watch politicians and particularly people being interviewed live, they will tend to use a lot of presuppositions in their language. And I'm going to give you some examples of how this sits around change. So I've just picked some random statements here and we'll just pick a few of them out and go through them in a bit more detail. So if you want to pop a few of them up, Andy, we'll go through them. So change is difficult. This is impossible. People need to, that's a fascinating one for me. People need to open their minds. We or I are not engaged, not managing effectively. My/their anxiety is out of control. There's loads of statements in there that are very much around presupposed language and language that people have to accept as truthful for it to make sense. Probably the easiest ones are the shortest ones, which is this is impossible and change is difficult. One of the strongest presuppositions in the English language is one of the smallest words, which is the word is, because is presupposes fact. There's no ambiguity, there's no grey area, it's a statement of fact. Change is difficult. So actually a very simple change to that kind of language is to replace is with can be, or could be, or has been in the past. But the minute we make that statement factual, change is difficult, that sets our minds going on the presupposition that it's going to be difficult. That's not to say we won't do it. It's not to say we won't engage with it, but arguably we're going to find it more difficult because we're already, in terms of our NLP, remember our plus or minus 7 bits of information, what we're leaving ourselves with is the presupposed fact that change is going to be difficult. I picked the middle one. People need to open their minds. I went to work with an unnamed organisation who were encouraging their staff to work in a more flexible and mobile manner. which, given the current climate, seems a very sensible thing to do. And they brought in a kind of publicist. They brought in someone to kind of do some of the communication. They paid a lot of money, and there's posters around the place and all these kind of, yeah, come on, we can do it. We can work in a mobile and flexible manner. And I was in the toilet, as you do, on one of my visits there, and I sat down and I noticed on the back of the door in front of me a wonderful poster, lots of brilliant branding, and it looked amazing. And the very first line said, "Open your mind to flexible and mobile working," which presupposes what? If I have to open my mind, what does that presuppose? Don't you answer that, Mr. Sanford? This is why I can't work out which way around this camera goes. Open my mind presupposes what in terms of factual language? I'll give you a moment. Absolutely. Yeah, that it's closed. If we have to open your mind, then the presupposition is that we have a closed mind. So it is, and positive intention, absolutely positive intention. Come on, guys, open your mind. It's going to be great. The problem with that is people who have open minds may well go, well, hang on a minute, my mind is already open. And those that don't are unlikely to be convinced by something telling them they should. So it's an interesting one. And these are just some examples. I'm sure you've got plenty of others you could think of. But, what are the presuppositions you're using with yourself? What are you telling yourself? What are you telling your partner, your children, your colleagues? What is the presupposed language? Are you presupposing success, or are you presupposing difficulty and failure? Not to tell you what to do, because you're all adults and the choices are yours, and not to sit here in judgment and say there aren't days where I don't say to myself, this is really, really hard or really, really difficult. It is to ask yourself, what impact does that have in terms of how you feel about the task at hand? So first, Lenny's rule, if you like, in terms of change, be mindful of the language you're using. Those of you in a work and professional context come into this webinar, particularly those of you in managerial positions and leadership positions, what language are you using with people when you're talking about change? Those of you in parenting roles, what language are you using with your children when you're talking to them about change? So regardless of what position you're in, being mindful of the audience around you and what message they're going to take from your language is really, really important. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should all go around using what one delegate once told me sounds very much like shopping channel language. Shopping channel language is, oh, isn't it wonderful that we're all going to experience this wonderful shift in our dynamic, and we will all wonderfully reflect back on the journey on which we've traveled, blah, blah, blah. We have to have some realism with what we're talking about. But remember, your reality may not be somebody else's, and something that you found difficult, they may not. So the minute you use that language as your presupposed fact, that is what it becomes. It becomes, if nothing else in language, a presupposition of a factual piece of information. There's loads of stuff around presuppositions. NLP is founded on principles of presupposition. And again, if you want more information, please do get in touch with Andy or myself and we'll send it through. But very simply, what is the language you're using? Grand. Thanks, Andy. So let's move on and have a think about your challenges in terms of what you are saying is difficult, is hard, is impossible. Just very quickly, again, just have a quick look through your polls. So what are the challenges that you're kind of dealing with? We've picked remote working as a particular example, but it could be something else. So it could be, parental or a kind of more personal kind of reflection. So whatever you think, whatever your challenges are, just have a bit of a flick through that one and give us some feedback on your poll when you can.
Just remember, Lenny, I've got to get this bad pun in. Remember, the devil is in the Dettol. That's my presupposition.
Yeah. Oh dear.
From the great leader that is Donald.
Yeah, let's not go there. Although I did see somebody saying, I was just thinking about him. Yeah, some really interesting presuppositions. And we could get into it because there's a whole school of thought around leaders and how leaders use language. And if you think about some of the kind of most horrific leaders, how have they got thousands and millions and millions and millions of people to believe them, to follow them, to vote for them. How do people do that? Well, very often it is rhetoric and language and how they go about using those things that they have to influence people. So I think I said this to you on the NLP course, on the NLP webinar. A lot of this stuff can be used very powerfully and in very positive ways, and unfortunately it can be used in the other way too. We want you to be using it in the most positive way, of course. So
it's quite interesting. The personal motivation one is coming out.
Really?
So, we were both having a discussion before the webinar about how we were struggling a little bit today, and personal motivation and getting yourself up for it was
okay. Well, let's sorry to interject again, Andy. Let's put a live poll now. We talked about imposter syndrome. I think there's definitely some relevance for that in our open forum. It might get a bit bitty in the open forum, but I want to cover as much as I can in the hour that we've got. So what about personal motivation then? Is there something for you guys around how do I get myself up for it? What is it I need to be doing? Now, obviously, there's a lot around controlled dartboard and NLP, and that will help some of the thinking, but is there something explicit that we can do around that? So just while you're thinking, Helen, in answer to your question, you've said this is the first webinar. Do we have the previous webinars? Absolutely, yeah. We've got controlled dartboard and videos on NLP as well. Andy, I'm guessing you could ping those out to Helen?
Yeah, they're actually in the handouts, a link to where all the webinars sit, plus the previous ones. So you can just go and get them on demand. So the previous two are there on demand. Just sign up. And
also for the next lot, we've still got another 4 after this one. So So self-motivation, someone's saying would be good. Yeah. Because we can link it to imposter syndrome, actually. What impact does imposter syndrome have on my motivation? So there is some kind of tenuous, but definitely, even if we did 15, 20 minutes on imposter syndrome, 15, 20 minutes. Yeah, that's an interesting one, Stephen, around goal setting. I think, I could be wrong, Andy. I think we've got that as an explicit topic.
I'm sure we have, yes.
Sure we have. So let's check it. If we haven't, Stephen, we can definitely do a bit around something we call a well-formed outcome. I'm hoping we've got a session on it because it really is, in terms of motivation, it's a huge motivator. How do I set myself goals? How do I keep myself kind of structured? Yeah, because as Helen's just said, lack of structure sometimes can be a bit, throw you out a little bit. So there's some really interesting, some new names here that I'm not recognising from last time. So if this is the first time you're joining us, thank you for joining us. And please do look at the other stuff that is available. So, all right, let's crack on then, Mr. S.
Yeah.
So in terms of driving the need for you to change, some of it people have started to put in the chat actually, but it's useful to just think about that again. So maybe rather than the kind of elephant in the room, which is obviously the coronavirus and its impact, maybe we could kind of try and crystallize it down a little bit. So what is the need for you to change? Obviously we have the driver around, most of us can't physically or being advised not to physically go into our places of work. So that in and of itself is change. What about those of you that are perhaps coming at this from a personal perspective and less from a professional point of view? So what are the changes you're having to kind of adapt to? Where are they coming from? What's the drivers around those? So again, apologies. I know it feels that there's a bit of a delay and you guys are catching us up, but it is useful to kind of get your thoughts around that. So what is driving the need for you to change? And yeah, maybe we can go on to the next one, and that's fine, because that is the dialogue. We're going to pick that up when we look at the change cycle. But yeah, how much of what you're having to experience is a choice you would make? M&A. I have to explain that one. Hyde, sorry. M&A, not sure about that one. Not being able to interact with people in the usual way. Changes in work in practice. That's interesting. Oh, legislation. Absolutely. Oh, wow. So pre-virus, I changed job role and needed to have a new sense of purpose. crikey, that's a hell of a driver. Moving towards retirement, managing work from home, yes, with children and reduced demand. That's interesting. Sorry, typed too early. It's okay, Heidi, you are working from home with children. So I think the fact that you typed at all is quite impressive. There's a lot around kind of being driven, although the umbrella is around coronavirus, there is a lot of that sits underneath that is much more individual. So I'm sure there are some of you that are having to homeschool children. Well, you never signed up to be a teacher. I think, there's a load of these motivational things on Facebook about, if you don't learn a new skill by the end of this, you were just lazy. Sorry, I don't subscribe to any of that. I subscribe to these are unprecedented times. And if you need to sit in front of the telly for a day and that's what you need to do, crack on. We're going to look later on at some of the simple wins that you can do around managing change. And one of the biggest ones, just give yourself a break. This wasn't what you signed up for. This wasn't what you cut out for. This wasn't your normal working day. So sometimes it's just being able to go, do you know what? It's okay. That's okay. She says, with having no children. How much of what you're dealing with is in your control? Some of the individual things you've talked about may be in your control. So things around managing work from home. I'm not saying that's in your control, but there may be some influence around that. Working with a young child around absolutely is challenging. Are there ways you could? So some of it is about, for example, Stephen's example of heading towards retirement. Well, age being as it is, you can't change that. That is going to happen. What you might be able to influence is what happens from where you are to when you retire. That is within your gift. So when we're looking at goal setting, which we will do either as an explicit session or as part of the next one, we talk a lot about, we start any goal with what is in my gift. Because if I start to formulate a goal around something I cannot control, I'm just setting myself up to fail. If I can't change it, then my goal is never going to be achieved. So we'll look at that when we look at the explicit goal setting stuff. Okay, we can move on, Ernst. Thank you all. So this is a big one for me. You probably heard me say this is one of my favourite coaching questions. I definitely mentioned that on the NLP course. What impact is it having on you? What impact is feeling this way having on you? In terms of, cope with the changing landscape, reduced demand, increased expectation in terms of parenting. It might be some of you are volunteering in your community, and what does that mean? I think one of the big elephants in the room that we haven't sort of articulated out loud is, for some of us, and I put myself in that category, the fear of what is out there. It is unprecedented. Somebody said to me, if you knew there was a murderer wandering around, you didn't know who it was and you didn't know where they were, you just wouldn't go outside. So it's, these are really scary times. And I think for a lot of people, that is how people feel. And that's okay. Again, that's okay. It's about, how do I move myself through that emotional cycle? And we've got some really good tips and techniques on that, which we're going to be looking at. I wanted to quickly cover off with you something that it has done a lot of research around, actually. And if you're a researcher and you like to kind of look into things in a little bit more detail, again, I would argue those of you in managerial positions, this is really useful. The headline we're looking at is something we call Change in the Psychological Contract. And I wanted to cover it with you because it has a massive impact on what we do and how we do it. So we got that headline, Andy? Did I put that? There we go. So changes in your psychological contract. What do we mean by psychological contract then? We all know what we mean by employment contract. We've all signed them. We all know I come in, they pay me this salary. That's what I get. I get X amount of holiday, etc. What we might not understand is the psychology behind a commitment. And that's not just about a work commitment. So we all have psychological contracts with our partners, with our children, with our teachers of our children, with our friends, with our neighbours. Psychological contracts are kind of unwritten, almost promises and expectations. And they are things that are implied rather than explicit. So by that, if you think about coming into work, you expect certain terms and conditions. You expect to have a desk. You expect to be able to park. You expect some of the reasonable things that are implied within going to work for a company. And it's the same as a parent. As a parent, part of your psychological contract is not to be teaching your children. That's the psychological contract you make with the school. That's what they do. We don't do that. Now, it's not written down anywhere, but there is an implicit expectation that that is what will happen. So if you think about some of the things that you've written in terms of the things you're dealing with or the things you're finding challenging, ultimately, a lot of it is a massive change in your psychological contract. You're having to parent children, school children that you weren't doing before. You're having to work from an environment that you're not used to. You're having to make your home your office for a lot of you, which for some people is really blurred lines. And one of the very simple tips I would give you is set up a space, go to work, because the mindset around that is really important. So the psychological contract, if you're interested in reading it, there's a ton of research around it, and it's fascinating to watch and to read about. We do a lot of it when we talk about managing change, because the more you can manage the implicit stuff, the psychological stuff, the more engaged people will be with the process of change. The more we do the stuff around the edges, no disrespect, Andy, but the process stuff and the kind of factuals, that's fine. That's very much the mind stuff. What you're perhaps not doing is the heart stuff. What are people expecting that they're no longer going to be getting, and how do you mitigate that a little bit? And again, I would reiterate, that's not just about work, that's about all sorts of relationships. So I want to flag that for those of you that like to have a read. It's a fascinating subject. And again, if you want any more information, please do send me an email. All right, we're going to move into the complicated model now. So bear with us, because between Andy and I, we've got to shoot around this model in some semblance of order and in some way in which it makes sense. So let's do that. Excuse me. I'm sure a lot of you have seen, whenever you've done change management research, looked into it, been on courses for it, I'm sure you've seen the John Fisher change curve. And the John Fisher change curve says we start change here, we kind of go up a little bit, we go down in the middle, and then we come up at the end, and then we end it, which is great. Unfortunately, what the Fisher curve suggests is that there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And as most of us know, change doesn't really work like that. So I might get it one day, then I don't get it. I might like it one day, then I don't like it. So the model I'm sharing with you is based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's grief cycle. And the reason I like it is because it's cyclical. And by definition, with a cycle, we can go backwards and forwards. So that's why we're using this model. There's loads of change models out there. I like this one. And I think I'll often ask people in a training environment, and I think it's fascinating to hear their answers. Does it surprise you, our webinar audience, to learn that change and grief are emotionally essentially the same thing? That, in other words, the emotional reactions we have to change are very similar to the emotions we have to grief. Does that surprise you, or does that seem to make sense?
Makes sense to me, because I've done your courses before.
Yeah, not at all. Doesn't surprise you. And of course, any of you that have experienced grief will know that it is one of the most significant changes that you can go through. So it does make sense. It is about loss, as Angela says. It's exactly about loss. What's fascinating for me, and we wouldn't do that. We would do this in a lot more depth on a proper change course. But I'll often talk to delegates about the difference between voluntary change and enforced change. So if you think about voluntary change, we tend to assume, well, it's voluntary change, so it's got to be good. We've got to enjoy it. It's got to be a good process. Why else would we be doing it? The problem with the voluntary change is it can still go wrong. There's still anxiety associated with that. It is still, by definition, a sense of loss, because it's taking away that which we knew. So I like this model because it's a really good way of reflecting on actually the whole process of change, whether it's voluntary or enforced, or kind of something I want or something I don't. It's still going to create some emotional responses. So we'll start at the top of the model. As you can see, we'll start with the cognitive response. So when change is first mooted, or when we first know about change, the first reaction we will tend to have is we'll think about, well, what does that mean? So I'm going to use the obvious one. If you think about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more, we didn't really know much about coronavirus. We sort of saw it on the news. We knew it was happening over there. We saw hospitals going up. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody is this black and white, but, you know, it was sort of over there, wasn't it? It wasn't really much to do with us at that point in time, because it wasn't much to do with us at that point in time. So in terms of our thinking process, the likelihood is the first thing we went to is the next stage on the model, which is denial. Well, it's not going to affect us, so it doesn't really matter. We'll watch that little bit, but then let's move on to everything else that's relevant at home. And you often see this process with change, so that people deny, and that by denial it doesn't mean la 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 I don't want to do this. It could be, I've had people say to me on all sorts of courses, and I do a lot of work with local government. Any of you that work in local government will know how ironic this next phrase I'm about to state is. I've had people saying to me on courses, we've been through our restructure. Well, that's that then, because as Andy's reaction would suggest, it's very rarely a restructure and now we're done. So the denial bit is kind of about just status quo. I'm going to stay where I am. I don't really need to do anything different, and therefore I won't. And from a performance point of view, and by performance I don't just mean outputs, I mean behavior, I mean life. We're not really going to see any difference in someone, because as far as they're concerned, nothing's changing. So it's very easy to just leave someone in denial, to just they're less bother, because then they're not bugging me, they're not complaining, they're not having a meltdown, they're just over there. The problem, of course, as we know, is you can't leave people in denial, because at some point they got to catch up. I think of it like, excuse my analogy, but knicker elastic. At some point that elastic's going to ping and they've got to catch up very, very quickly. And the danger with that is they haven't had time to acclimatize, to reconcile, to get the skills and behaviors that they need to be able to deal with that change. So tempting as it is to leaving someone in denial, in order for them to move through the process, we need them to get to the stage at which they acknowledge the change. Now, the emphasis here is the word acknowledge. It's not accept, it's not get on board with, it's not, be the champion of. It's purely acknowledge and recognize that the change is happening. So at some point we need to get and help individuals, or indeed ourselves, to get from that stage of denial to acknowledgement. So if you think about, when it first hit our shores, we had to acknowledge it. It was there. It was on our doorstep. We could no longer think it was something that was happening, as somebody said on the chat, in movies. Suddenly it was real, and we had to acknowledge it. Now, the danger now becomes that as we move down into the bottom half of the model, now it's real. Now we are having to deal with it. Now it is on our doorstep. And this isn't just about coronavirus. This could be about anything, small change or significant change. But what will happen as we acknowledge the change is we then have to deal with that cognitive process. So it's here. What does that mean for me? How do I feel about that? How do I react to that? So what you're likely to see at that change is at that point is a significant change in someone's behavior, because at this point you will see what we call a confusion and reacting stage. Confusion and reacting is, what does this mean? How am I going to deal with this? So if you think back, those of you that have been perhaps working from home for, was it 4 weeks now? Maybe a little bit, I don't know. Anyway, whenever it was, how did you feel on day one of that? For those of you that are parenting your children for the very first day, how did you feel on day one? For those of you that have made other changes, how did you feel at that very beginning stage? Because I guarantee you, confusion and reacting pretty much describes it. What do I do? How do I do it? How's this going to work? I can't make this work. And again, there's so much around the language we use here. Now, what I love about this part of the bottom part of the model is it's much more emotional. Therefore, as a trainer, it's much more behavioral, because behavior is driven by emotion. So I often get drawn in or asked to come into organizations to manage these bottom aspects of this model, because it's far more emotive. It's far more visceral. It's far more vocal, because people are, as the names here, the words here are suggesting, they're worried, they're stressed, they're anxious, they're fearful. Now, they might not always be that. They might actually be positively responding in terms of their behavior. But it's a process, and people have to go through that process to get where they need to be. So the way in which we do that is things like controlled dartboard. So actually, is what I'm confusing and reacting to even something I can change? If it's not, maybe I have to accept it. We talk about, there's tons of models, things about understanding someone's preference in terms of how they like to communicate. So if I've got someone who's very visual, I might, in terms of helping them move on to acceptance, I might mind map it for them. So this is where we are, this is what it will look like. If I'm talking to someone who's much more auditory, for example, they'll need to talk it through. They'll need to talk it out loud. So the more I can understand myself and the individuals around me, the more I can help them move through this process of confusion and reacting into the stage of acceptance. Now, I'm shortcutting this model massively. This is a whole day normally we would spend on this model. So much like NLP, we are sort of shoehorning it in a little bit. But there's tons of bits we can do there. And again, if you are managing this process, be that as a professional or a personal, and you would like to know some tools and techniques to sit there, give us a shout. We'll send you some bits out. Now, the acceptance, confusion, reacting, acceptance comes to the bottom part of the model, which is a far more, as I've alluded to already, emotional response. Because at this point, I'm no longer denying change. I'm having to deal with it. I'm having to adjust. I'm having to learn what this means for me, my family, my friends, my colleagues. So what you do sometimes see at the point of which of acceptance is that actually people can't accept it. They won't accept it. And if I'm working with organizations around managing change, very often when we get people to this stage in the model, they will leave the organization. Now, often when I say that in training, people go, oh, crikey, bring you in and everybody leaves the organization. Well, there's an element of that. Yeah, I think sometimes being external, you can rattle cages that perhaps internally you're not able to do. But also for me, it's my duty of care. You as managers, you as parents, you as colleagues and friends have a duty of care to the people in your care, whether they're friends, loved ones, whoever they may be. And actually, sometimes the right thing for someone to do is to go, is to leave, is to change. I had a lady on a course a while ago, and she said my organisation was making changes that just didn't sit with my value set. We were being asked to do things, to cut corners, to shortcut the service that I just couldn't get on board with. And she said I could have stayed and I could have become a saboteur or angry or just gone along with it just to get paid. And she said I just couldn't. I couldn't accept it, so I left. And I would argue that's the right thing for that individual, and definitely from an organizational point of view, the right thing for an organization. The problem for a lot of us at the moment is if we get to the stage of acceptance and we can't accept it, we haven't really got a lot of choice.
No.
Not really anywhere to go at the moment. So that's why coming back to Stephen's point about setting goals is really, really useful. It might be my goal is, what am I going to do in 3 months' time when all this is finished? 3 months, 6 months. If you listen to my mother, who I'm sure is still with us, she'll tell you it's at least a couple of years. And she may well be right. I'm not suggesting she's not. What I'm saying is sometimes having goals that sit beyond what's happening now can help you to accept what's happening now. One of the main models that sit with confusion and reacting without question is control dartboard. So if that's where you would say you are at the moment, dump everything, get a load of Post-its, write it all out and use your control dartboard. So if we move forward, what we need to get to and what aspirationally we're looking to get to, because what we're dealing with confusion and reacting and denial is past orientation, how things were or how they perhaps are currently. What we're not doing is looking to how they're going to be. So as we move through the confusion and reacting acceptance stage, we move into, through the emotional domain at the bottom of the model, we move into the testing stage of the model. Now, testing is about trying out new ways of working. So for those of you that started working from home on day one, how different is it now? What's the technology like? How are your Zoom meetings working? For those of you that were parenting, sorry, I keep saying that. I'm hoping you're always parenting. For those of you that were teaching for the first time as parents, what's the routine like now? How have you got into some sort of structure? Because in testing that out, you're now creating your future, how things are or how things are going to be as opposed to how they were. So testing is essentially trying out new ways of working, trying out new things. Now, both these bits still sit, sorry, I think I must have messed up the slide. At the bottom of the slide we should have, and it'll come up at some point, emotional response. There we go. So testing still sits in the emotional stage. Now that surprises a lot of people because they go, well, why would it be emotional to test new things out? Why would that be a problem? Well, the problem, of course, is when you're trying something new, there's a chance it might not work. There's a chance not only might it not work, it might go horribly, horribly wrong. Now, the danger then is if you've managed to schlep yourself all the way around this model, you've gone through control dartboard, you've had a word with yourself, you've tried out new ways of working, you've tested them all out, and then something goes wrong, and this is why I like this model, you may end up, sorry, Andy, we need that arrow all the way back, you may end up going all the way back to denial. Oh, I knew this wasn't going to work. I told you it was rubbish. Don't know why they're making us do this. These flipping teachers sitting at home, lording it up.
A lot of people mentioned having problems with connection. So, you know, and I know a lot of people are having those problems. And all of a sudden, like you say, you're right back to that stage of going, no, it's not going to work, is it?
This is rubbish. This is a waste of time. And then, unfortunately, what we've got to do is go back through the process again. What I would argue is the more aware we are of where we are in the process and the tools we used last time, arguably the quicker we can move through the process. So just to be mindful that you can go backwards and forwards on this model in a day, in an hour. Ideally, we want to keep moving forward on the model, but that's why I like it, because it is a more true reflection, I think, of how change actually works, which is far more all over the place. With the testing stage, we eventually get to the stage at which we're reviewing what worked, what didn't work, what have we learned, how are we going to make adjustments going forward. And now we're much more, as the model suggests, moving into future orientation, how things are going to be, how the new kind of culture is going to look, or how our new normal is going to be. Keep hearing this new normal, whatever that means. But, you know, that's exactly it. What is my new normal? What is my new working pattern? How do I now communicate with my children? How do I interact with my partner? How do we create our own space when we haven't got that space? So there's loads of kind of ways in which we can get to that, or loads of things, if you like, we can run through the model to get to the other side. But ultimately, what we need to start doing is start implementing our new way of working. So once we've tested it, once we've reviewed it, I like this, I don't like that, this works, that doesn't work, we then implement it. We then go, okay, so this is it. I work from home now. But when I work from home, I sit over in that corner. Or those of you that have children, and I appreciate with young children, this is probably not as easy to do, but, you know, I don't know, 2 hours every morning, mum's working. And that, you know, that is our new routine. That's what we do. Now, I know it sounds very easy, and I appreciate, as someone who doesn't have children, it's probably nowhere near as easy as that. But it's like anything, it's neural pathways. And if we can retrain our thinking and retrain others' thinking, it just becomes the new normal. Tell me on your first driving lesson, you didn't get to the end and go, I'm never going to be able to drive. I'm going to kill someone. This is deadly. Why are they putting me in charge of this vehicle? And now, how often do you just get into your driveway and go, well, I'm home. I appear not to have hit anything. I appear not to have damaged myself or anyone else. I couldn't tell you what direction I came. I couldn't tell you any traffic lights. Muscle memory has got you home because you've done it so many times. So implementing becomes our implemented way of working. This is our new culture. This is how we now operate. So I'm trying to keep an eye and keep an eye. So, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it took a week to harmonise, someone was saying. Fantastic. And that's huge congratulations, because I would argue to get 4 adults, I assume, or at least 4 grown-ups, in a space at which you probably don't often occupy the same space, in a week to create a blend that harmonized is fantastic. What I would say is the more explicit you can make it, the quicker that can happen. So it's that psychological contract. You know, it's implied that 4 people very rarely spend time together, but now you have no choice in that. So now you have to kind of comply with that completely blown out of the water psychological contract. What does that mean? How's that going to work? What's that going to look like? I think for those of you that are isolating, self-isolating on your own, you know, think about your psychological contract. You've had connections, I'm sure, with other people. You go out, you go to coffee, you go to choir, you go to whatever it is you do. You keep yourself busy and occupied because you choose to. Now, unfortunately, you may not be having that choice. So your psychological contract, your implied relationships are not there. So how do you create a different kind of environment? Or how do you connect in a different way? So implementing, there were tears along the way, I bet there were, but we got there. Implementing then becomes our new normal. The problem with implementing is it's very easy to go, well, there we go, we're done, sorted. We've had our restructure. We're in, using Helen's language, harmony now. That's it. We've accomplished it. The problem with that is it's very easy to become complacent and just go, well, that's it and we're done. So the best way to avoid complacency, won't shock you, is more change, is to go back through the process of change. One of the things I talk about a lot, whether I'm talking about this with individuals in terms of coaching or organizations in terms of culture, is that change should be evolutionary, not revolutionary. There is a real kind of lurching from change to change, and that they're big and huge and significant, and they create a massive reaction in people. So a very simple technique for those of you that manage people is to have a heading on every single one of your team meeting agendas that says change. And even if there's nothing to say, you say nothing, but you have it on that agenda every single week, because then we're talking about change as part of our business or part of our lives or part of our everyday circumstance, rather than something that we just do in times of crisis. So you've got the model. Again, if you want to check anything out with me, ask me any other questions or need further information, just ping us off an email. So in terms of what can be useful then along the way, there's loads of things. I noticed people on here talking about mindfulness. Yes, very much so. Mindfulness, meditation, hugely helpful. I would argue NLP and understanding the principles of NLP. But if we look specifically at what can be helpful in terms of managing change, sorry, Karen, we call this the change cycle, and it's based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's grief cycle. I don't know, I've never actually tried to Google it. I assume you could Google it, but if you have any problems, give me a shout. You'll have a copy in the handout, of course. So if we want to go on to the next one, Andy, we can look at what are some of the things that could be useful. We've said already, do acknowledge that things are changing. Not always easy, and not every day. Some days you just want to go I don't want to know, not interested. Hide your head, do whatever you want to do, just get away from it all, because that's okay too. But at some point you will need to acknowledge that things are changing. Doesn't mean you have to accept them, you just need to acknowledge them. Okay. We've said already, again, sorry, a lot of this I've already said. Any change can cause stress. Voluntary change can cause stress, because you could argue with a voluntary change, if it all goes wrong, who's to blame? So arguably, voluntary change potentially would be more stressful than enforced change. But it's definitely something that we don't necessarily recognise, that actually even voluntary change can create stress, can cause stress. So just be mindful of that. I think this is a biggie, regular schedule. And that's why, coming back to Stephen's point about goal setting, that's really important. I touched last time on this with you guys. I think that I have a little to-do list that involves two things, one thing around the house and one thing for the business. And that's my every day, that's my routine, that's my regular schedule, but also regular in terms of timings of things. You know, when do you get up? When do you go to bed? Just try and keep normal as possible. Seek support. As a coach, of course, I would say that, but as a friend, I would say it. As a daughter, I would say it. As a wife, I would say it. You know, lean on the people around you, because it is important that we connect. There is a danger sometimes in change where we should arguably connect more, that actually what we do is we internalize and we become more introverted, and we do also unfortunately become quite self-centered. So it's kind of, what do I need to do? But actually connections and connectivity in terms of managing change is really important. Oh, hello, someone's not knocking. I don't know what that's all about. Crikey. Don't know what happened there. I just pressed something, so hopefully I haven't cut everybody off or anything. So yeah, structure, really important, regular communication, but support too. You know, don't overlook. I would say, for those of you that are key workers, or indeed for anyone, I'm offering pretty much our coaching sessions for free. You know, just give yourself a break, give yourself an hour to think about you, to invest in you, whomever that's with. Write down the positives that have come from this change. There's loads for me. You know, if I think about, and Andy will attest to this, 6 weeks ago when we started talking about, I didn't want to do any of this, did not want to do it, wasn't remotely interested, had no desire to do so. But actually for me, there's been loads of positives. I've been far more proactive with the whole side of the business that I've never really involved myself with, which is the marketing and the PR and the logo. Didn't even have a logo 6 weeks ago, folks, believe it or not. Rubbish as it might be, it's still a logo, and I'm still very proud of it, Mr. Sanford, before you start flagging it off. Thank you very much. So, you know, what's come out of it that's positive for you? And it might seem trite, but, you know, connection with relationships, connection with family, connection with your children. You know, you'll never get this time back again. It's the weirdest thing, but it could be the most wonderful too. What else have we got? I have to remind myself here. I like this one. Reflect on times at which you felt this way before and what did you do then? One of my favorite coaching questions. So I'll often get people come to me and say, I just can't do this. Can't do it, or I'm not confident, or I don't have the ability. And one of my favorite questions is, when have you felt this way before and what did you do? What were the resources you brought to bear? Because 9 times out of 10, our experiences are not brand new. We've had some point of reference in the past. So what did you do? How did you manage it? What were the resources you had then that you could call on and utilize now? And it's recognizing, as I said to you on the NLP website, without getting all cheesy about it, you are your best resource. You are the best resource you have. So kind of what is it that you can use that you have? And, somebody said webinars, absolutely. Webinars, books, research. It's all about muscle memory. The more you do something, the more it becomes normal. It becomes how you do things. So reflect on what you've done well. What else have we got there? Yeah, this is a good one. I said this to you last time. I'm Greek. Apologies. I'm going to correct myself. I am Armenian. Apologies. My mother picked me up on this last time. It's a shortcut to say I'm Greek, but I'm actually not. I'm Armenian. So I'm Armenian. I'm a woman and I'm an Aries, which gives me a huge hot temper. And I can vent with the rest of them and the best of them. There's a really interesting guy called Nigel Risner. If any of you are into kind of further reading, he does a book about communication. It's called It's a Zoo Around Here. And he talks about 4 types of animals. And I saw him recently give a keynote speech. And he said he and his wife have agreed we're allowed to vent for 9 minutes. If either of us go over 9 minutes, and this is him I'm quoting, not myself, we have to get naked. I'm not sure. To be honest with you, I think if I got naked, my wife would vent for another 9 minutes. But yeah, whatever it is, it's a silly thing that he does. But it's catching yourself in, when is this no longer cathartic? And actually now I'm just creating a problem in and of itself.
I think I just need to pick up quickly here. So, bearing in mind Trump telling people to do stuff, if you're going to use that, please don't vent when you're in public.
Yeah, don't get naked in public. You can get arrested for that sort of thing. So I'm led to believe anyway. But yeah, I think it is mindful to be aware of venting. Actually, someone's put here, we'll make team meetings interesting. I actually think it's really healthy to start a team meeting with a rant, because it clears the decks. It's cathartic. It gets, we think about controlled dartboard. Certainly when I use it within organizations, the first thing I do is I say to people, moan, whinge, bitch, complain, get it off your chest. Because if we don't do that, it's not going to go away. It's still going to be there. And actually, all you're doing is losing credibility as a manager. Oh, not the naked bit, but putting the time limit. Yeah. Sorry. All you're doing as a manager is losing credibility by going, everything's fine, isn't it? Let's just crack on with the meeting. So yeah, why not put an agenda item that says, what's got you goat? What's annoyed you? What's paddled your canoe? And words to that effect. So then to a point. Yeah. Okay. What else? The last one, I think, on this one. Oh, no, sorry, there was one after this. Back away from social media. I have never in my life, I'm not the generation that's massively into social media, but I am into it and I use it. The false news and the kind of hysteria that's created around social media, frankly, is just scary. So I think there is something for me about being aware of, if nothing else, how much time you're spending on social media and what your graduate sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Gravitating towards, not graduating towards. If we come back to NLP, plus or minus 2 7 bits of information, what are the 7 bits you're filling your head with? Because if those 7 bits are all doom, gloom, catastrophe, the world is going to end, then that becomes your reality. So actually just challenge yourself around that. Actually, is this true? Is there other stuff? Is there other messages out there? Are people recovering? Rather than just be aware of the emphasis on social media. And the last one, I think, is one I've already covered, which is give yourself a break. And if that means giving yourself a break by letting yourself be miserable, letting yourself be unhappy, letting yourself have a bad day, do it, and do it some more. But use the tools we've talked about. Think about control dartboard. Be mindful of NLP. What are you focusing on? What is your reality? Think about the language that you're using to yourself and to others. This is difficult. This is impossible, which is even stronger a presupposition. So I think that's probably probably. Oh, okay. I think we've probably already done that one, Andy. So maybe we'll whip over that one for now. I'm just a little bit conscious some of you are having to leave us because it is that time. One of my favourite NLP phrases is there is no failure, only feedback. The amount of times I get people coming to me as a coach and saying, this has gone wrong and I'm never doing it again because I utterly messed it up. Well, then that becomes your reality, doesn't it? I think I mentioned this on the last one, apologies. The filament in the electric light bulb was hundreds, tens of times before the filament was right, before Thomas Edison got it right. If he'd done it the first time and said, well, I've messed that up and stopped, we'd all be sitting in the bloody dark.
Have you heard the one about Dyson? 40,000 iterations.
There's loads. Walt Disney schlepped ideas around so many. Viagra was not supposed to be Viagra when it was first. Wasn't supposed to be used for the intention it ended up being used for. We won't go into that, but get us into your organisations. This and more exciting stories from me and Anne. So there is no failure, any feedback. Just to quickly whip through this one. This is based on the Gibbs reflective cycle. Any of you that work in social work or social care will know this one, I'm sure. So what happened? What was it that I reacted to? What was the situation? Describe the situation. How did I feel about that situation? What was I thinking and what was I feeling in relation to that? So it might be, I don't know, my description might be being asked to do a webinar. How was I thinking and feeling? Well, given we're not using expletives, I'll leave that up I'll leave that up to you to fill in the gaps. Then we've got kind of the evaluation. So what was good and bad about it? Actually, what did I learn? What will I take away? What were the positives? Oh, yeah, Wrigley. Yeah, that's another one. Yeah, do Google Viagra. It's a fascinating read. Radars as well. Something to do with radar. What else could I have done? So kind of what could I have done differently? This for me is where Control Dartboard comes into it. Actually, could I have done anything differently, or was it out of my gift to change? So what conclusion do I draw? And then finally on that one, kind of if it came up again, what would I do? The really simple way to articulate this is the what, the so what, the now what. So what happened, so what, and now what am I going to do? So the really simple reflective cycle is about what am I learning and what can I put in place next time? It's extremely useful to learn in terms of, rather than calling something a failure, it becomes something I can learn from. Okay, so I think that does take us to our very last slide, which is our usual slide, which is thank you again for being here and giving up your time. Somebody's just said they actually look forward to Tuesday lunchtimes now, which is marvellous, lovely feedback. Thank you very much. I would say it's hard to keep up with the chat stuff, and much as I don't like to admit it, I am a huge egomaniac and massively all about attention. So if at any point you want to kind of articulate any of those directly to myself or to Andy, please do so. That there is nothing like feedback. It's why we do what we do. So we would really, really appreciate any feedback you have. And I think that's probably me. Remember, in the next 2 weeks, we've got your open forum. So, ping us off some emails, challenge us, see what it is you want to do with that. Definitely, we've got imposter syndrome and we'll do some stuff around motivation. But if there's anything else, do let us know. All right, hand you back to Andy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lenny. That's amazing. Margarine's another interesting one for something that wasn't created for what it's used for now. Just to let anyone know, bit.ly link, storytelling and data. We've got a fantastic professor who literally wrote the book about storytelling and data visualization. So if you or any colleagues are interested in that and would like to potentially win a copy of his book as well, do join that webinar. It's next Tuesday. So in the break between these next sessions. And thank you, as always, so much for your time. Thank you, Lenny, for the wonderful stuff, as always. And we'll see you next time. And thank you for turning up. Thank you for listening.